the journey of the soul. Our goal is a little before, a lot after, to really understand the now. So we were discussing the soul coming down, the soul volunteering. We said this is right away in utero, right away from conception. There was a connection to a soul, how the soul is pre-taught all of Torah before it enters the body during that 9-month period to allow it to absorb Torah in this world. So the soul descends. When the soul descends, the soul is really going through what we call the 4 spiritual worlds. This is obviously a Kabbalistic concept that Hasidus uses a lot, that we live in a physical world. We're on planet Earth, and we're in an entire Milky Way galaxy that's all physicality. In the Zohar, it discusses spiritual worlds. And in Kabbalah, it speaks of spiritual worlds. In Hasidus, it speaks of spiritual worlds. None of those spiritual worlds are anything like what we think of by the term of a world. So we're not talking of, cities and traffic and people, and it's all a pure spiritual reality. World means like a layer of space, and then a different type of space, and then a different type, and then a different type. Parable I think of is just like we have planet Earth, and Earth is part of this, little corner of the universe. We're in this little quiet corner of the galaxy. That's why we haven't had like a nova explosion here. That's why man survives. That's why God did it this way. In the busier, flashier parts of the universe, things are constantly colliding and destroying. But we live in a quiet little corner. We've got, Mars and Venus and Jupiter and Neptune. We know our little planets. We know the sun. We are our little corner. So similarly, we have a spiritual solar system. We have our physical world, and we have 4 spiritual worlds. And then there's vast things going on beyond those 4 spiritual worlds, which we're not going to talk about because it's not all relevant to what we're saying. The soul comes, in essence, from the highest levels of the highest world. And every soul has to travel from that highest world through 1 and or 2 and or 3 and or 4 of the spiritual worlds until it comes to our physical reality. Why am I giving the ands and the ors? Because ideally, we would like our soul to travel as little as possible. Every level in the journey actually creates or implies a covering over of the soul's powers. And then another level, and then another covering over, and then another level, and then another covering over. Basically speaking, every world has 900 levels. So if a soul has to go through all the levels of all the worlds, that's 3,600 covers before the soul can enter this world. Now that soul in her core is no less godly than any other soul, so to speak, but there's a lot of barriers to get through. What determines how many levels that soul has to descend? God. It's like everyone gets, like, I think of like in the olden days before we had Google or Google Maps or Waze, there was this thing of going to, the AAA and getting a triptych where they sort of mapped out your journey for you. I'm talking about a long time ago. So it's, so to speak, every soul is given a triptych. How many stages you have to go until you've arrived spiritually at what your soul needed to reach, and then you could directly go into a body. So the greater the person, so to speak, the greater the soul, the shorter the journey. It's also very impactful exactly which level is the final stage in the soul's journey. Is it going to be a purely emotional space? Is it going to be an intellectual space? Is it going to be this perfect balance of intellect and emotions? Because that final stage really impacts what I'll call the personality of the soul, and therefore the personality of the person possessing that soul, because your soul is you. Your core self is your soul. So how many layers the soul went through is going to determine how covered over that soul is. And where the final destination was very much impacts the soul's expression. But even a soul that literally has to go through all 900 levels of all 4 worlds, which means it's coming to the lowest of the lowest of the lowest dimensions, still that soul has all of the spiritual powers to serve Hashem perfectly. Not that I serve Hashem perfectly. I don't know if you serve Hashem perfectly, but in theory, I could. In theory, I have that spiritual power. Every single Jew has enough spiritual power, no matter how many levels they went through, to serve Hashem perfectly. But of course, we really would like to access maybe some of those covered over strengths. I think of it like the Russian stacking doll, that you have a doll, and then inside you'll have a more precious one, or a more beautiful one, a more beautiful one, a more beautiful one. That's how it is with our soul. We have the powers that are covered over, and then we have more and more precious powers that sometimes we can do the work and uncover. Now, all of this that we're talking about happens before the person's born. Because as I'm saying, there's a connection of soul to body from conception. For those 9 months, when the soul has not yet descended into the body, there is still a relationship. Sometimes we could, God forbid, have a stillborn or a miscarriage. Those souls are still connected to those bodies, meaning, well, the child never lived. It was a miscarriage. It was a stillborn. There was never a person. No, we don't look at it like that at all. There was a person, because a person is defined as a soul, and there was a soul, because that soul connection starts from conception. That's why the Lubavitcher Rebbe says that these children also have Tchias HaMesim, meaning a child that never was, a child that was a stillborn, a child that was a miscarriage. They never were, and yet they are. They will have Tchias HaMesim because there always was a soul connect as that body was forming, and therefore there was a person, and therefore that person will come back.
But I have a question.
Sure.
Doesn't like the soul go into different bodies?
You're saying
Like
you're
aren't there
saying
different like
a Gilgul?
parts? Yeah, aren't like different parts of like one soul that does different jobs in different bodies?
Not exactly. It's a little different than that. A soul has parts, and that soul has parts within your body, meaning there's the intellectual aspect of your soul, which is within your brain. There's the emotional aspect of the soul, which is in the right side of your heart. And there's the action orientation of the soul, which is in your liver. So, and then there's two other higher aspects that aren't inside your body and have different powers. That definitely makes a difference to which, if I'm studying Torah right now, it's my neshama element, it's in my brain. If I'm feeling a love for Eretz Yisrael, it's in my heart, it's my ruach. If I'm cooking for Shabbos, it's my nefesh, it's in my liver. So that's how it works. Not that one soul simultaneously would split among people. Meaning at this moment, there's not a few other people walking the streets that have pieces of your soul. That, I mean, obviously we know a husband and a wife share a soul, but that's a very different concept. But there's no people that have different fragmented parts of your soul. What is true, which you might be referring to, you might have heard, is that souls come back for reincarnation. We will talk at length about reincarnation. And in the reincarnation process, sometimes the entire soul doesn't come back. Meaning, if a certain part of the soul was complete, there's different reasons why there's reincarnation. There's different reasons, and sometimes the soul comes back because the world needs that soul. Like as a generation, we came back because the world needs us, because we're the generation of redemption. We were all by the Tower of Babylonia, of Babel. We all messed up there. We all came back and were enslaved in Egypt and got us out and brought the redemption. And so we're very good at bringing redemption. We've done it before. And we all came back to be the generation of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, which is a different type of spiritual redemption. And now we all came back to do it one more time. So there's reasons a soul can come down that have nothing to do with flaws or lacks on their part. But sometimes souls come down because of flaws and lacks, either because they did something wrong that they need rectification, tikkun for, or because they didn't do right. A soul has to keep coming back until that soul has done, fulfilled, or studied every one of the 613 commandments. So if a soul is coming back for rectification or for completion, meaning there's some lack, it's possible the entire soul won't come back. It's possible that part of the soul has been completely refined and can, as we'll call it, enjoy Gan Eden, while the other part of the soul that hasn't been completely refined comes down. But it's not that simultaneously different aspects of your soul will be given to different people who are alive simultaneously. That doesn't happen. Any other questions?
Yes.
Go for it.
So, okay, thanks. I actually have a few questions.
Okay.
So where do we get the 900 layers in each world?
You want me to
And what-
explain it to you?
Please, and what does that even mean? Yes.
It's going to be very technical. I'll explain it, but I'm saying it'll be a little technical. So if people are like getting bored or something, I'll try to make it a little shorter. Every world has 10 dimensions, what Kabbalah calls the spheres or sphirot. A sphera means a manifestation of God's energy. There are 10 sphirot, shining, luminous lights of God, 3 intellectual and 7 emotional, or 3 intellectual, 6 emotional, 1 a state of being, whatever. Those are the 10. I'll give you a mushal. There's a palace, there's a mansion. It has 10 floors. The soul starts off on the 10th top floor, like the Penn Suite. The suite on top, the penthouse, that's where the souls start off. The 10th floor of this mansion. On every level, it's very like monochromatic. It's all exactly the same. It keeps repeating itself. There are 10 rooms because every sphera subdivides into every other sphera. So again, it's Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvur, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yisod, Malchus. These are the 10 spheres. And they each subdivide in all of the 10. Like, let's take the sphere of Chesed, kindness, loving kindness, God's loving kindness. Well, loving kindness is expressed in 10 ways. There's Chachma Shebechesed, the intellectual, creative spark of how that kindness could be expressed. Like, oh, that's such a cool idea, what I could do, what I could create, what I could actualize. Like I could make a workout gym to enhance my whole community. That's a spark of Chachma of Chesed. Well, there's Bina Shebechesed, the understanding, thinking, I have this idea, but does it work? And let me crunch it and analyze it and synthesize it to make it reality. There's Das Shebechesed. Das Shebechesed is when I internalize and live it. There's Chesed Shebechesed, the ultimate, etc. You understand the concept. So every floor has 10 rooms. Within every room, there are 3 tables: gold, silver, and copper, just like the Olympics. You got the gold, you got the silver, you got the copper, which symbolize 3 subsidiary levels in each of those rooms. Like in Gevurah Shebechesed, there's Neshama of Gevurah Shebechesed. Then there's a lower level, Ruach of Gvurah Shebechesed. Then there's a lower level, Nefesh of Ruach Shebechesed. At each table, there's 3 chairs: gold, silver, and copper. So you could be, so if we want to test our understanding, the highest possible option on this first floor, which is Chachma, would be Neshama, Shebe Neshama, Shebe Chachma, Shebe Chachma. Which means, in our story, you're sitting at the gold chair of the gold table in the top room of the top floor. Okay, now to understand this, like I so to speak, obviously this isn't how it happens, but I'm making a story to make it make a little sense to us. The neshama goes from chair to chair, from table to table. She has to go. So she has to sit on the gold chair of the gold table, and then the silver chair of the gold table, and then the copper chair of the gold table. Then she has to go to the silver table and sit on the gold chair of the silver table, and the silver chair of the silver table, and the copper chair of the silver table. And then she has to go to the copper table and sit at the gold chair of the copper table, and the silver, and the copper. And then she goes to the next room. So if we understand that, on every floor, you got 10 rooms, 3 tables in each room, 9 chairs in each room, because you got 3 chairs for 3 tables. That means every floor is 90 levels, right? 90 times 10, because we got 10 levels, is 900 levels. So in every mansion, which symbolizes, I mean, a very concrete thing for a very spiritual reality, we have 900 levels. Now, there are 4 mansions, because there's 4 spiritual worlds. So we have 900 and 900 and 900 and 900. So if this soul went, which he's not going to, but whatever, from the gold chair of the gold table of the first room all the way through 4 mansions till the copper chair of the copper table of the final room of the final floor of the 4th mansion, she would have, so to speak, sat at 3,600 chairs.
Okay, sorry, processing. Okay, so the next question is, you said that the Rebbe said that from conception that there's a connection between the soul and the body.
Yes.
So Al Pi Halacha,
No, that's not from the Rebbe. That's not a chiddush of the Rebbe. The chiddush of the Rebbe was, I mean, I don't know if it's only the Rebbe says this. Maybe others have also said it, but the Rebbe says that any child who is a stillborn or a miscarriage, I mean, obviously, after 72 hours, any such child will have tchias hamesim. I don't know if anyone else says that besides the Rebbe. But the idea of the soul having connection to the body in utero, no, I mean, it speaks about that in the Gemara. That's not any chiddush of the Rebbe.
so that's okay. Please excuse the phone that I'm ignoring. So there are actually other people who say that there's that immediate connection between the soul and the body. My question is, my understanding is that until 40 days, the soul doesn't enter.
The soul doesn't enter. I know the soul didn't enter at all. The soul doesn't enter until after you're born. I'm not talking about the soul entering. I'm saying a connection. The soul doesn't enter until after the child's born.
So we're talking about just the connection.
Meaning that this piece of flesh inside you is a real person. That's the point we're making. That's why we hold that unless there is obviously a rabbinical reason, because your life comes first, after 72 hours, abortion is considered murder. Why is it murder? At the earliest stages. Why is that murder? Because there's a soul connected to that flesh. It's a life. So that's the point we're making. And therefore, obviously, as we're saying, this is I think it's a chiddush of the Rebbe, though, again, maybe others say it, I honestly don't know, that all of these children will have tchias hamesim, because they're real children. They never were born, but they're real children. We are not at all talking about when the soul enters the body. I will discuss that soon. And that happens in stages after the child is born. Doesn't it happen day 1 or day 2 of their birth? You know, like it happens over time.
Okay, so then the last two questions I have, one of them then is if the soul is already connected to the body, and that's simply from conception, and maybe this is too much of a tangent, but if ab hilacha, we consider conception, even when people are going through IVF, an embryo transfer. So the minute there's an embryo transfer, then halacha deems that to be conception. So then the soul's already connected to the body, which means then there is, because I guess,
You're saying, and then these embryos get frozen?
right,
I
right.
don't know. I'm not going to answer anything I don't know. I have no clue.
Oh, no. Conception is not when the embryos are made. Conception is when the embryo is transferred into the woman.
Oh,
Until
okay.
it takes
So you're
place.
saying when it's fertilized and within the body and impregnated and within the body of the woman.
Right. That's the point where halacha considers it to be conception.
Okay, so then that would make sense.
Okay, so then the last question I really have at this point, I'm sure I'll have more, is then, so if the machshavos of the couple determine also the neshama and where it's coming from, and every neshama descends into the body going through these four spiritual worlds and has these, with the muscle that you gave, which really was very clear with the different floors and the tables and the chairs, then is it the machshavos that determine where the soul is coming from and what layer it's able to come from, or how short its journey is? Or is it simply the layers that the machshavos are determining?
Okay, so all right, so it's a big question. I'll try to explain. It's a big question you're asking. It's a very practical question. You know, it's reality. We all have children, or want to have children, or will have children, or did have children. Generally, meaning there might be exceptions, but the general rule is that we do not determine the neshama of our children. We do not. And the classical example given is that Abraham was born to Terach and a Misle. His father was Terach, the promulgator of idolatry. His mother's name was a Misle, which means emes lo. In other words, falseness, deceit. Those were his parents. So there's no way they did something to deserve an Abraham, to draw down an Abraham. We never determine the soul of our children. But we do determine something, which is very significant, which is, I'm going to call it the skin of the soul. It's called Kabbalistically in Hasidus, the levush, the garment. But a lot of words in Kabbalah and Hasidus are very fluid, which means it depends on context. Also in the Gemara, we see this sometimes. Olam haba. What does it mean? It could mean Gan Eden. It could mean Mashiach. It depends on context. So the term levush, garment, could mean a lot of different things. But when the Zohar speaks about this and the Zohar discusses this, it's the skin of the soul. It's not the soul. We do not determine the soul of our children. We determine the skin of the soul. So it's written in the Zohar, it's a very important thing to know, that thoughts of a parent during conception determine the spirituality of that skin. Again, the term isn't skin, the term is levush. I'm using the term skin for it to make a little easier for us. What is the function of that skin? That skin is basically the transfer point between the soul and the world. So if the neshama wants to express itself outward, well, it has to go through that skin. If the neshama is receiving from Hashem or from her study of Torah or from the commandments energy, it has to go through that skin. So the more refined that skin is, the more spiritualized that skin is, the more natural is the flow. So if parents are very focused during conception, and this is a potential moment when you could be drawing down a child, drawing down a soul. So you want to draw down the most spiritual garment possible, and you're really focused on this. That neshama merits that she has a very, very refined skin, which she might be a higher soul or a lower soul. That has nothing to do with the parents. But whatever soul she is, as I said, even the lowest soul, which means it literally went 3,600 levels, so to speak, has such a refined skin, so it's so natural for the soul to impact the person. It's a very easy transfer, and it's so easy and fluid for all the godliness to penetrate the soul. That's what the parents do. So they do not determine the soul itself, but they do determine that skin. Now, I know sometimes there are stories of some tzaddikim that pulled down certain souls for their children. So I don't know anything I have to tell you. I know the stories, but I don't know if that means the skin and we're just saying soul, or if they truly could do that. But the general rule is we can't.
It did, but I have another question with that answer then, because I'm thinking about someone like Chizkiyahu, who purposely originally didn't want children because he knew he was destined to have Menashe, this Russia, at the same time, if he was so conscious to draw down the most refined garment or skin possible to have that transfer point, couldn't that have altered who, instead of a Russia, that it should have been at least?
Every person, in case you never realized, has Bechira Chavshis. If you remember the story from Navi, Yeshaya told him, don't worry, it'll be my daughter and you. I'm going to be the grandfather, like we're going to make sure this kid's going to be okay. Well, guess what? He wasn't. He wasn't doomed. Pre-knowledge is not predeterminism. Menashe was not born doomed. Think of it like a pendulum. A pendulum means as far as it goes in one direction, it's going to go in the other direction. So if Menashe had such evil, of course he had the potential of such tzidkus. Look at his parents. Look at his grandfather. But Chizkiah saw what would be. Okay, we're going to move on because I know we've got a lot got to cover here. Dina, what was your question?
Just a quick question. Sorry, I'm just a little sick, but so we were talking a few Shabbosim ago about if, let's say, with IVF or with fertility treatments where they're like freezing embryos, like freezing actually made embryos, are there no halachic like problems with that because the neshama
So
hasn't entered it?
I am not an expert, but what I can tell you is every time someone does fertility treatments, it has to be under the hashgacha of some rav. Just like when you go in the store and you buy your crackers or your cheese or your bread, you need to see a hashgacha, and there are better hashgachas and not as good hashgachas. So any fertility treatments also needs hashgacha, and like in everything else in life, there are better hashgachas and not as good hashgachas.
I think that they were talking about like people who are not religious who just don't know that. And like what everyone's doing with all their like
Yeah,
unused
I don't
embryos.
know. I'm
Okay.
not going to comment. I don't.
Okay.
Okay, fine. So we spoke about the soul, and you got a lot more than I thought I was going to tell you about it, which is totally fine because everything that we said is good for someone to hear. So we understand this a lot more. We understand the personality of the soul. We went into this very important topic of parents at conception, determining the spirituality of the soul's accessibility to godliness, which makes a tremendous difference. I do want to make one little point of that, which I didn't say, but just because this is a very realistic scenario, and I have met many people that came from very not holy points of conception. And yes, it's very impactful. It's very, very, very impactful. You can definitely see it. But a person can always clean their lavush, meaning whatever the skin was determined by your parents. But if the parents were not in a holy place or very, very, very much not in a holy place, that doesn't remove the possibility of the person himself, obviously with a lot of effort, but it's possible. As I said, every soul is mega powered, clean and refine that garment. Okay, so we spoke about the connection of the soul to the body. We spoke, therefore, there always will be Tchias HaMesim. Always, these are your children. They will come back to you by Tchias HaMesim, by Mashiach. Our general assumption when looking at children that are stillborn or miscarried is that they're very high souls. I can't guarantee everyone, but that's the general assumption. Why? Because as we were mentioning before, in terms of reincarnation, most souls are coming down because there's a tikkun. There was something wrong that they have to rectify, or there's a hashlama. There's something they didn't do before that they need to do. A soul that only needs to be in utero for a few months obviously has a very minor tikkun, a very minor hashlama. So that's why the assumption is these are very, very, very holy souls. There's many, many, many stories, I'm not going to tell you, of very holy souls that are just in the womb because as they're within the body of the mother, especially if the mother is serving Hashem, the mother's learning Torah, the mother is davening, the mother is eating kosher, this gives the child what the child needs. Obviously, it's still very sad for us. I'm not taking away the pain of it at all, but it's a good frame of reference to understand that this was a very holy soul that chose you. Someone shared this with me recently. I mean, it's about a special needs child, but I think it's equally appropriate. This woman who actually adopted 4 special needs children, and she was saying how this vision of how each of these children chose her. This will be the mother I need. And of course, in a sense, it's true for all our children. And of course, for these children that don't need to actually be born, it's also true as well that we were chosen. Again, it's painful, it's sad, and it really is painful and really sad, especially if it happens multiple times. But there is this concept here of like we being the right home, the right vehicle for this child. There's a famous story with the Baal Shem Tov, but I don't think I'm going to say it now. Thinking of our time, but a very, very famous story with the Baal Shem Tov with a childless couples and things along this line. A very, very, very famous Baal Shem Tov story. Just to understand that concept. The soul connection is from birth. Eliza was like, when does the soul get in our body? I said gradually. Why gradually? Because our soul is much more powerful than the other energies that are the competition, right? We have the soul, and then on the other side, we have the animal soul and the evil inclination. So if you put them in a ring for a knockout, the soul on one end of the ring and the animal soul and evil inclination on the other, it's no contest. In a second, the animal soul and evil inclination are on the floor. They're done. They're wiped completely because the soul is so, so, so much more powerful. So that sounds really nice to us, and obviously I would prefer that storyline, but that's not Hashem's storyline. Hashem's storyline is not for us to knock off in seconds our animal soul and our evil inclination. There's a verse from Job, from Eov, Adam la'amal yivolad. Man is born to work. I know we don't love that quote, but it's the truth. Adam la'amal yivolad. Man was born to work. And that phrase answers many philosophical questions, like, why is life so hard? Why are we so challenged? Why Hashem is all-knowing and all-loving. What is he doing this to us for? Because man was born to work. Because we're here to work. We're here to accomplish. We're here to give. We're here to change. We're here to make a difference. So that's why we can't have a knockout. That's why there has to be the struggle of the two sides. So in order to maintain that struggle, what we call b'chira chofshis, to have the free will of two equalish and opposite ends, we give the animal soul a bit of a head start. So the animal soul is right born as the child is born. The child has a body, the child has an animal soul. Evil inclination, right there at the beginning. Child is living, child has an animal soul, child has an evil inclination. Now the child has a godly soul. As we said, that's from conception. But the godly soul is not within the body. Within the body means much more impactful. So we don't want it to be so impactful. I mean, we do, but Hashem wants it to be balanced. So the godly soul, which as I just said earlier has 5 levels, is not within the body and enters gradually. First level, lowest level of the soul, as I actually mentioned a short while ago answering your question, is the nefesh. The nefesh is the action orientation of the soul. It's found in the liver, and the nefesh enters when a girl should receive her Jewish name, if she does or doesn't, and when a boy should receive his circumcision, his bris, if he does or if he doesn't. Because obviously some children never get Jewish names and some children never get a kosher circumcision. But at the moment when they should, the nefesh enters their liver. So that's the first lowest part of the soul, now able to impact them internally. The next level is called the ruach. It's the emotional and speech orientation of the soul. It enters to the right side of the heart. And it enters, is what's written, because I only know what's written, at the time of education. So that might sound like an ambiguous term, and I can't tell you more than that. I'm assuming it means around age 3, because in other places in Torah thought, we speak of education beginning at age 3. That's why the upsharing is at 3, things along those lines. So I'm assuming it's 3, but I can't guarantee you. The next level is the neshama, what we often call a soul, a neshama, which is a term for a soul, but it's also a term for the 3rd level of the soul, so that can be a little confusing. The neshama is the intellectual orientation of the soul. When you study Torah, when you're thinking how to help someone, when you're thinking how to do a mitzvah, that enters the mind, and it enters at bar or bat mitzvah. So you see girls have an awesome head start over boys. Both at birth, a girl's going to get her nefesh a number of days before a boy will get his nefesh. And a girl's going to get her neshama a year before a boy gets his neshama. That's the base soul. So by bar bat mitzvah, the base soul has entered the body. Enter the body again is very significant because that's when it can impact you much, much more. It's within. It's not encompassing energies that are sending you messages, so to speak. It's within. There are 2 higher levels of the soul. I said a soul has 5 parts. The chaya and the yechida. The chaya, which is really our will for God, is generally outside of us, unless the person is very refined and holy, and then it comes in. And the yechida is the highest level of the soul. It's the pure pleasure in God. Generally, it comes into a person on every Rosh Chodesh, because the Yechida is the Mashiach element of the person. If you've ever heard that every Jew has a spark of Mashiach in him, which is true, that spark of Mashiach is in our Yechida, and since Rosh Chodesh is the most Mashiach day of the month, we get our Yechida every Rosh Chodesh. It comes in Yom Kippur by Ne'ilah, right? That powerful holy moment, hour or so. The Yechida is within us. It would come inside a person anytime they are doing something al kiddush Hashem, any action of Mesiras Nefesh or anything along those lines. This sacrificing oneself for God the Yechida is within the person. But otherwise, the Chai and Yechida give us energy, but they're too refined to get into our bodies. Aliza, what's your question?
So does this then explain the Gemara that talks about how a child is born with a Yetzer Hara, that until Bar Baz Mitzvah, where they then become responsible, that they're only a Yetzer Hara and that they don't really have the full Yetzer Tov?
I don't know because I'm not looking at that inside, so I don't want to say it is, but it definitely makes a relationship. Again, it's not that you have no. Yetzer Tov is like the lowest level of your soul. It's like the Yetzer. The Yetzer means the form. So it's the lowest expression of the Nefesh. So you do have that inside your body from when you should get your Jewish name, when you should have your bris. But in general, the principle is true. In general, yes, that is why you don't have your full base soul, Nefesh Ruach Neshama, in your body until you're Bar Bat Mitzvah. And that's why you can't be obligated in mitzvahs because you don't have enough soul power to do them. But once you have your base soul, meaning from a Jewish perspective, we could look at a 12-year-old girl as quite immature or a 13-year-old boy. But from a spiritual perspective, they have as much soul power as I do. I have a Nefesh Ruach Neshama inside of me. They have the Nefesh Ruach Neshama inside of them. Is their mind developed? Probably not. But, everything is balanced. So they have their own struggles and I have my struggles. But their base soul is in their body from their Bar Bat Mitzvah. And that would be, yes, when you can, so to speak, drive out the evil inclination because you have this base soul in your body. But really, as I'm saying, it's gradual. It doesn't just all come at the Bar Bat Mitzvah. That would be like, wow, really, really hard. So we do have it starting from a few days after birth, the soul inside of us. Any other questions on any of this?
Yes.
Sure.
And then also the Chaya, where you said that it usually resides outside the person, but occasionally can be within the person. Is that then more like the aura or the energy that we perceive about a person?
Not necessarily, because that aura could also be the aura of what you've done, your Torah and your mitzvahs. There are studies on aura that measure the aura of people when they're davening, when they have tefillin on, when they're in the middle of a mitzvah, and the colors of the aura change as per what they're doing. So that could also determine the auras.
So what would you clarify then the difference between the Chaya and the Yechida? I understand from what you said that the Yechida comes in, that's the Mashiach element, and we experience that more Rosh Chodesh and Yom Kippur, and then I'm assuming also on Purim. But I guess
I don't know if it's on Purim, though I can understand when you're saying that, but I don't know. I only know what's written. I don't know if it's on Purim. The
Okay.
Chaya is the level of will for God. All a soul wants is to serve Hashem. The only desire of a soul is to serve Hashem. All of your levels of soul. They're very one focused, obsessive. They only want God. Your nefesh wants Hashem, your ruach wants Hashem, your neshama, your chai, yechida only wants Hashem. They just have different ways of expression, their powers of how they are able to connect to Hashem. So chaya is your will for Hashem, because your will is what creates everything else of your thought, speech, and action. And your yechid is even deeper than that, because deeper than your will is your pleasure, meaning what you have pleasure in, that's what you're going to create a will for. So your pleasure in Hashem, which is the deepest, deepest, deepest expression of self, is the yechida. And one level lower than that is your will for Hashem, and that's your chaya. And we're saying, basically, to have the will, the chai inside your body, you need to be a tzaddik on some level. So most of us never get our chai inside our body. But we all get our yechid inside our body, even though the yechid is higher. Because the yechid is coming at these special, special moments. Like Rosh Chodesh, like the Mashiach day, and the yechid is a Mashiach part. Like Ne'ilah of Yom Kippur, because it's a time of Mesiras Nefesh, of giving over our soul to God. When we say those last lines of Shema Yisrael, we're supposed to be envisioning we would die for God. That's the Yechida energy. Anyone who is dying for Hashem or is engaged in an act of sacrifice for Hashem, Mesiras Nefesh for Hashem, the Yechida is inside of them. So we don't get the Chaya generally, but we do get the Yechida.
So then I'm sorry, one more question. When we talk about the Ratzon, so I guess I'm thinking of let me think, is it from Torah Or? From where the Alter Rebbe explains the Ratzon and I guess actually I'm thinking about this. It really is talking about the soul's pleasure and the soul desire to connect, and that's the drive. So then it's really the Ratzon that drives everything else.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
That's how we all work. We pretend we're intellectually oriented. We pretend, we fool ourselves and say we do things because of our logic and our reason and our intellect. Not true. We do things because of our will. And our will comes from our pleasure. The soul, her pleasure and her will, and therefore her intellect and her emotions and her actions are just connection to God. That's all she wants.